The next group of glands we saw earlier in the last video, they are sebaceous or oil glands, and they're widely distributed except for the thick skin of the palms and the soles. So they're going to be everywhere else, and most of them develop from hair follicles and secrete into the hair follicles. So this is what's going to account for oily hair. They're relatively inactive until puberty, just like the sweat glands as well. They're stimulated by hormones, especially androgens. They secrete sebum, and they are an oily, hollow holocrine secretion. This sebum is bactericidal, which is good. It kills bacteria, and it softens hair and skin as well. So a summary of the various cutaneous glands that we've looked at is shown on this slide. We can see in the first two columns are the sweat glands, the eccrine sweat glands, as well as the apocrine sweat glands. Remember, the eccrine sweat glands play a role in thermoregulation, temperature control. They release a hypotonic filtrate of the blood plasma because they're mostly water. They also release their product via exocytosis, so they're called a merocrine gland. And they secrete onto the skin surface, and they're essentially everywhere, especially the palm, soles, and forehead. The apocrine sweat glands are a little larger, as you can see here. They are coiled up just like eccrine, but smaller, and they may act as sexual scent glands. They release a filtrate of blood plasma with the added proteins and fatty acids. So there's no proteins and fatty acids in the eccrine sweat gland. They also secrete their substances via exocytosis. And they're usually in the upper part of the hair follicle and rarely the skin surface. And again, they're in the stinky areas. That's an easy way to remember it, the axillary and the anogenital regions. The third type is the sebaceous glands. And the sebaceous glands, these are going to be the oil glands. So again, it's important for you to remember that the sudoriferous are going to be the traditional sweat glands, the eccrine and the apocrine, but the oil glands are going to secrete sebum, which is the oil, and they're associated with the hair follicle. So they lubricate the skin and hair. They secrete sebum, which is an oil secretion. They work as holocrine glands, and they're everywhere except the palms and the sole, sometimes in the upper part of the hair follicle. So our next slide is a clinical homeostatic imbalance. So acne is usually an infectious inflammation of the sebaceous gland, resulting in pimples, pustules, or cysts. So it's associated with the Propionibacterium acne infection. Whiteheads are blocked sebaceous glands. If the secretion is oxidized, that whitehead becomes a blackhead. And overactive sebaceous glands in infants, which is what you see on this infant here, is called seborrhea, also known as cradle cap. Begins as pink raised lesions on the scalp, and they turn to yellow brown and then flake off. You can see they're kind of turning to a yellow brown color here and will eventually flake off. So the various functions of the skin are shown on this slide. As we know, the skin is the first and foremost barrier, and there are 6 various functions: protection, body temperature regulation, which would, of course, be thermoregulation, cutaneous sensations, metabolic functions, blood reservoir, and also excretions of waste. So we'll be going through these individually in the next few slides. This first slide is on protection. So skin is going to be exposed to so many things, as we know. It's exposed to microorganisms, abrasions, cuts, temperature extremes, and harmful chemicals. So it needs to have three different types of barriers for this protection. The first barrier is a chemical barrier, and that's because the skin secretes many chemicals, such as sweat, which has antimicrobial proteins, and sebum, which kills bacteria. So from the sudoriferous glands and the sebaceous glands. Also present in the skin is what's called an acid mantle. It's just like what it sounds like. An acidic means a low pH, so the low pH of the skin is going to prevent bacterial multiplication. The next part of the chemical barrier is melanin. And as we know, melanin is the pigment produced in the deepest part of the epidermis. It provides a chemical barrier against ultraviolet radiation damage. The next type of protection is physical, and that's because of these tough, flat, dead keratinized cells of the stratum corneum. They can block most water and water-soluble substances. And then finally, the last protection is the biological barrier, because the epidermis has phagocytic cells. Remember, these phagocytic cells are called dendritic cells of the epidermis. We have to have specific cells because there's no blood supply of the epidermis. So remember, one of the functions of epithelial tissue is that it is avascular. So the dendritic cells engulf these foreign antigens and present them to white blood cells, therefore activating the immune system. And then the dermis, since it is vascular, it's going to contain macrophages that can activate the immune system by presenting them to white blood cells, just like the dendritic cells that did. The next function is thermoregulation, body temperature regulation, and under normal resting body temperatures, the sweat glands produce about a half a liter a day of unnoticeable sweat. A noticeable sweat is called insensible perspiration. But if the body temperature rises, the blood vessels in the dermis will dilate, and they do so to increase sweat gland activity to cool the body down. And it could be up to 12 liters or 3 gallons of noticeable sweat, which is called sensible perspiration, designed to cool the body. If it's cold, the opposite is going to happen. In this case, instead of the dilation of blood vessels, the blood vessels are going to constrict to conserve that fluid in the body so it's not lost. So the skin temperature drops to slow passive heat loss. The third function is the cutaneous sensation. And the cutaneous sensation begins with sensory receptors. So it's really part of the nervous system. They're what are called exteroceptors because they're on the external surface of the body. They respond to stimuli outside of the body, like temperature and touch, or free nerve endings that sense painful stimuli. So this would be an example of a receptor. You may remember that this specific receptor is called a Meissner's corpuscle. So there's no images on the lecture exam, but you will need to know them for lab, so make sure you could identify a tissue section like this.